Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. In preparation for this deep dive, I came across this fact that just stopped me in my tracks. Eminent creative achievers are 7 times more likely to have what's called reduced latent inhibition.
Reduced latent inhibition.
Yeah. Basically, their brains don't filter out information the way most people's do.
Well, that's interesting.
And it got me thinking, what if, a little bit of noise is actually the secret ingredient for creative breakthroughs?
That's a fascinating idea. It really challenges our assumptions that a perfectly ordered mind is the key to creativity. What if it's actually the people who can tolerate a bit more chaos who are able to see those unexpected connections?
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, the link between creativity and mental illness. We've got research spanning centuries, from historiometric studies of iconic figures to cutting-edge neuroscience.
It's amazing how for so long this connection was kind of dismissed as just pop psychology. But now we're seeing a growing body of evidence that suggests it's far more than just a catchy theory.
It's not a simple one-to-one relationship, though.
Right.
Not every creative person is dealing with a mental illness, and not everyone with a mental illness is the next Picasso.
Exactly. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we should probably define what we mean by creativity, because it's so much more than just artistic expression.
Yeah, it's a good point. People tend to picture, a painter or a musician or a writer. But creativity can do so many forms.
Absolutely. Researchers have actually identified different types of creativity, like deliberate versus spontaneous, or cognitive versus emotional.
Interesting.
Think of Thomas Edison meticulously testing thousands of materials for his light bulb. That's a perfect example of deliberate cognitive creativity.
Right.
But then you have someone like Mozart seemingly channeling music, effortlessly tapping into that wellspring of emotion. It's a completely different type of creativity, but it's still creativity.
And that brings up another misconception, that you need a genius-level IQ to be creative. We've all heard of the threshold hypothesis.
Yeah.
But is there really an IQ cutoff for creative achievement?
Well, studies have shown that while creative potential might be linked to IQ, creative achievement is not so clear-cut. Even individuals with lower IQs can accomplish incredible creative feats. It seems like other factors are at play.
This is where things get really interesting, I think. Those historiometric studies, for example, analyzing the lives of figures like Van Gogh and Hemingway and Sylvia Plath, they paint a complex picture.
Yeah, they do. The rates of psychopathology in these individuals are definitely higher than in the general population. You see recurring themes of depression, addiction, even suicide. It's really quite striking.
But it seems like these patterns vary depending on the type of creative field.
Oh, absolutely. For instance, studies have indicated that poets have a significantly higher rate of psychopathology compared to scientists.
Really?
Almost 87% of famous poets studied showed signs of mental illness versus only 28% of eminent scientists, which is much closer to the general population.
Wow. So could it be that the emotional intensity inherent in poetry somehow contributes to these mental health struggles?
It's certainly a possibility. And these patterns aren't just limited to individuals. The families of highly creative people also tend to have a higher prevalence of mental illness.
Oh, wow. So there could be a genetic component.
Potentially. But it's important to remember that correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because creative people are more likely to experience mental illness doesn't mean that one directly causes the other.
Right. There could be other contributing factors like shared environmental influences or personality traits that predispose individuals to both.
Yeah.
It's a complicated web we're trying to untangle.
It really is.
So let's move beyond those historical figures and look at what psychiatric research on living creative individuals is telling us.
Okay, so the findings actually echo those historiometric studies. Present-day creators, particularly artists, show a higher prevalence of mental illness, especially depression and bipolar disorder.
It's a pattern that keeps emerging. So I'm curious, are there certain personality traits that might make creative people more susceptible to these challenges, or conversely, help them cope with them?
That's a great question. And that's where those psychometric studies come in.
Right.
Researchers have used personality tests like the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI, to assess creative individuals.
Right.
And what they found is fascinating. While these individuals do score higher on scales associated with psychopathology, they don't necessarily meet the criteria for a full-blown diagnosis.
So they're not quite normal, but not clinically diagnosable either. It's like they're occupying a space between those two worlds.
It's a beautiful way to put it. And here's where it gets even more interesting. These same individuals also tend to score high on traits like ego strength, self-sufficiency, emotional regulation.
So they have these strengths as well.
Exactly. And these qualities might actually help them channel their experiences into creativity instead of letting it overwhelm them.
So it's almost like they have this inner resilience that allows them to kind of harness the intensity of your experiences.
It seems that way.
Fascinating. Okay, so let's move from personality to the brain itself. What's neuroscience telling us about all of this? We've all heard that creativity is all about the right brain. Is there any truth to that, or is that just a myth?
It's more nuanced than that. While earlier research did emphasize the right hemisphere, we now know that creativity involves a complex interplay of different brain regions and networks. In fact, there are 3 large-scale networks that are thought to be particularly important for creativity: the executive attention network, the imagination network, and the salience network.
3 networks. Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
All right, so let's start with the executive attention network. It's located in the outer prefrontal cortex and parietal lobe, and it helps us focus our attention, control our thoughts, stay on task, and filter out distractions.
Okay, so for those of us who struggle to stay focused, that's the network we need to work on.
You could say that. Then you have the imagination network, which resides in the deep prefrontal cortex, the temporal lobe, and the parietal lobe. This network is all about daydreaming imagination and generating those aha moments of insight.
So that's where the magic happens.
You could say that. And lastly, we have the salience network, which is located in the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and anterior insula. This network acts as a kind of filter, helping us determine what's important and what we can ignore.
So it helps us prioritize.
Exactly. Now here's the key takeaway. For creativity to really flourish, it seems that the executive attention network needs to relax its grip a little, allowing the imagination and salience networks to take the lead.
Interesting. So it's about finding the right balance between focused attention and letting the mind wander freely.
Exactly.
But there's another piece of this puzzle that I find particularly intriguing: latent inhibition.
Latent inhibition, yes. Think of it as your brain's spam filter. It helps you ignore irrelevant stimuli so you don't get overwhelmed by the constant barrage of information coming at you.
So it keeps us from going into sensory overload.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember that fact I mentioned at the beginning? Eminent creative achievers are 7 times more likely to have reduced latent inhibition.
Wait, so creative people are actually less able to filter out irrelevant information?
That's right.
Doesn't sound kind of counterintuitive?
It might seem that way, but consider this. Perhaps this reduced filtering allows them to make connections that others miss. They're seeing the world through a wider lens, taking in more information, and finding meaning in the seemingly mundane.
That's a fascinating concept. It makes me wonder if a little less filtering might actually boost our own creative potential. But hold on. Isn't reduced latent inhibition also linked to conditions like schizophrenia?
You're right. Studies have shown that people with acute phase schizophrenia also exhibit reduced latent inhibition. This overlap is actually why creative individuals sometimes score higher on those measures associated with psychopathology.
So there's this shared neurological mechanism that can manifest as either creative brilliance or mental illness, depending on other factors.
That's the current thinking.
Wow. And this is where genetic studies become crucial, right? Because they're starting to unravel the specific genes that might be involved in both creativity and mental illness.
Exactly.
Have any specific genes been identified?
There are some promising candidates like the DRD2 and DRD4 genes, which play a role in dopamine signaling.
Dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter. What does that have to do with creativity?
Well, it's more than just feeling good. Dopamine is involved in reward, motivation, pleasure, all of which are vital for the creative process. Other genes of interest include the 5-HT2A gene, which is involved in serotonin signaling, and the NRG1 gene, which is involved in brain development and plasticity.
So these genes might create a vulnerability to both creativity and mental illness, depending on other genetic and environmental factors.
Precisely.
That leads us to this fascinating framework called the shared vulnerability model.
The shared vulnerability model, yes. This model suggests that creativity and psychopathology share common genetic and environmental risk factors.
Okay.
However, there are also protective factors that can tip the scales in one direction or the other.
So it's not just our genes, but also how our environment and experiences interact with those genes.
Exactly. Think of it like a recipe with multiple ingredients. The shared vulnerability factors might include things like novelty salience, neural hyperconnectivity, and emotional lability.
Okay, those are some big words. Can you break those down for me?
Sure. Novelty salience refers to being drawn to new and stimulating experiences. People high in novelty salience are constantly seeking out novel information and ideas.
Okay. That definitely sounds like a creative trait. Always looking for the next exciting thing.
And it's also associated with things like addiction. Then there's neural hyperconnectivity, which means increased communication between different brain regions. This can lead to creative insights, but also a tendency toward overthinking and anxiety.
So it's like having a brain that's firing on all cylinders.
Yeah.
That can be both a blessing and a curse.
Exactly. And finally, there's emotional lability, which refers to rapid and intense shifts in mood. This can be a source of creative inspiration, but also contribute to conditions like bipolar disorder.
So the same trait that allows artists to tap into a wide range of emotions can also make them more vulnerable to mood swings.
Exactly. Now, on the flip side, we have protective factors that can mitigate the risks associated with these shared vulnerabilities.
Like what are some examples of those protective factors that can help tip the scales toward creativity instead of mental illness?
Things like high IQ, cognitive flexibility, strong working memory, a supportive environment. These factors can help individuals channel their vulnerabilities into creative expression rather than mental illness.
So it's not just about our genes. It's also about the choices we make and the environments we cultivate.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the question of how specific psychiatric disorders relate to creativity. Let's start with mood disorders, particularly bipolar disorder.
Okay, let's dive into that.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of discussion about the link between bipolar disorder and artistic creativity.
Right, and for good reason. Research has consistently shown a strong connection. Studies have even shown that people with milder forms of bipolar, like cyclothymia, and first-degree relatives of individuals with bipolar disorder score higher on measures of creativity.
So even having a genetic predisposition to bipolar disorder might be linked to increased creativity.
That's what the research suggests.
And then there are those famous cases like Vincent van Gogh, Robert Schumann, and Sexton.
Exactly. Numerous biographical studies have highlighted the prevalence of bipolar disorder among eminent creators.
But is it bipolar disorder itself that fuels creativity? Or is it more about those periods of hypomania, that state of elevated mood and energy that often comes with the condition?
That's a great question. And the evidence actually suggests that creativity is particularly pronounced during milder forms of bipolar disorder or a family history of the condition. It seems that creativity thrives in that sweet spot between stability and intensity.
So too much instability in the creative process gets derailed. Too much stability in the spark might fizzle out.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial for individuals with bipolar disorder to manage their condition effectively, both for their mental health and their creative output. So now that we've kind of laid some groundwork, I think it's worth kind of zooming in on bipolar disorder, specifically, since it's so often linked to this idea of artistic creativity.
Right. It's become almost a cliche, this image of the tortured artist with bipolar disorder, pouring their intense emotions into brilliant works of art. But as we've seen, there's actual research that supports this connection.
Yeah, definitely. Studies have consistently shown a much higher prevalence of bipolar disorder among artists, writers, musicians, compared to the general population.
But what is it about bipolar disorder that might actually drive creativity? Is it the condition itself? Or is it more about those periods of hypomania, those bursts of elevated mood and energy?
That's a really key question. And the research actually suggests that it is the hypomanic phase that is most closely linked to increased creative output. During these periods, people experience that surge of energy-racing thoughts, increased confidence, decreased need for sleep.
So it's like their minds are in overdrive,
Yeah.
making connections, generating ideas at an accelerated pace.
Exactly. And this hypomanic state can be incredibly productive for creative endeavors. Artists might find themselves overflowing with inspiration, working tirelessly on their projects, producing a flurry of work.
But this all sounds a bit too good to be true. What are the downsides? I mean, we know hypomania can also lead to impulsive behaviors, poor judgment, even risky activities.
Absolutely. And as hypomania escalates into full-blown mania, the creative process can get significantly disrupted. Focus can be lost, thoughts become scattered, and the work might become disorganized, even nonsensical. That delicate balance is lost.
So it seems like there's a window of hypomania where creativity really flourishes.
Yeah.
But if it goes too far, it can backfire.
Exactly. And that's why managing bipolar disorder effectively is so crucial, both for mental well-being and for creative output. Finding that balance is key.
This reminds me of the work of K. Redfield Jamison, the psychologist who has written so extensively about bipolar disorder from both a personal and professional perspective. Her book, Touched with Fire, Manic Depressive Illness and the Artistic Temperament, really delves into this connection.
Jamison's work is incredibly insightful. She's so open about her own struggles with bipolar disorder and how they have influenced her work. And Touched with Fire makes such a compelling argument that bipolar disorder, while being a source of tremendous suffering, can also be a source of profound creativity.
It's like that double-edged sword we keep coming back to. Mental illness is not a simple, straightforward experience. It can have both positive and negative effects on a person's life.
Absolutely. And that's such an important point to remember as we move on to discuss the next condition, one that's often linked to creativity, but with a more complex and debated connection, schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Schizophrenia.
Yeah.
The story of John Nash, the brilliant mathematician who grappled with schizophrenia, is often cited as an example.
Yes. Nash's story is both fascinating and tragic. He made such groundbreaking contributions to mathematics, but also lived with severe mental illness for much of his life. And his story, popularized by the film A Beautiful Mind, really brought the complexities of schizophrenia into the public eye.
Right. But as captivating as Nash's story is it really representative of most people with schizophrenia?
Not necessarily. While Nash's case is definitely noteworthy, it's important to remember that full-blown schizophrenia often impairs cognitive function, which can make it very difficult to engage in creative activities.
So is it fair to say that the link between schizophrenia and creativity is more nuanced than simply saying one causes the other?
Definitely. There's a whole spectrum of experiences within schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Some individuals might find that their symptoms actually enhance their creativity, while others might find them to be a significant hindrance.
It sounds like we're back to that delicate balance again. Too much of certain symptoms can be detrimental, while a touch of those same symptoms might actually be beneficial.
Precisely. It's also really crucial to make a clear distinction between schizophrenia as a clinical diagnosis and schizotypy, which is a personality trait characterized by unusual perceptions, eccentric thinking, and a tendency towards social withdrawal.
Right. Schizotypy is often described as being on a spectrum, with schizophrenia at one end and what we might call a normal personality at the other.
That's a helpful way to think about it. And research has actually shown that individuals with higher levels of schizotypy, particularly what we call positive schizotypal traits, tend to score higher on measures of creativity.
Positive schizotypal traits. What are some examples of those?
They might include things like magical thinking, unusual perceptual experiences, a tendency to see connections that others often miss, and a heightened sense of intuition.
So could it be that these traits, when they're not too intense, can actually enhance creative thinking?
That's what the research suggests. These traits can offer a unique perspective and a willingness to challenge conventional thinking, potentially leading to novel ideas and artistic expression.
But again, too much of anything can be a problem. Could those traits, if they're too strong, tip the scales towards psychosis?
You're right. If those traits become too pronounced, they can lead to disorganized thinking, difficulty distinguishing between what's real and what's not, and even hallucinations or delusions, which can definitely interfere with the creative process.
So it's a tightrope walk, navigating that line between creative brilliance and cognitive chaos.
A great analogy. But it's important to remember that not everyone with schizotypal traits will develop schizophrenia or experience those negative consequences. For many, these traits simply add a dash of eccentricity and unconventional thinking to their personalities.
That's reassuring to hear. Okay, so let's switch gears again and talk about another topic that's often romanticized when we talk about creativity substance use disorders.
Ah, yes. The image of the tortured artist seeking solace and inspiration in a bottle or a haze of smoke.
Right? We've all heard those stories of famous creatives who battled addiction. Is there a real link between substance abuse and creativity? Or is that just a romanticized notion?
Well, the relationship is complex, and it's important to approach this topic carefully. While some studies suggest that moderate alcohol use might have a temporary loosening effect on inhibitions, potentially leading to a short-term increase in creative output, the long-term effects of substance abuse are undeniably negative.
So that romanticized image of the artist finding their muse in a bottle, is that likely more fiction than fact?
Most likely, excessive alcohol use can impair cognitive function, disrupt sleep, and contribute to depression and anxiety. All of these things can ultimately stifle creative expression. And the same goes for drug use. While some drugs might offer a temporary boost in energy or focus, they ultimately lead to addiction psychosis and a decline in overall well-being, which includes creative output.
So while there might be a fleeting increase in creative output during those early stages of substance use, the overall trajectory is downwards.
That's the general pattern we see. And it's important to be mindful of how this romanticized portrayal of substance use can actually be dangerous and misleading, especially for those in the creative world. It glamorizes risky behavior and downplays the real and serious consequences of addiction.
The story of Ernest Hemingway, the brilliant writer who battled alcoholism, comes to mind. Sadly, his struggles ended in suicide.
Yeah.
Carlos Baker's biography, Ernest Hemingway, A life story really details those challenges with addiction.
Hemingway's story is such a potent reminder that the notion of substance abuse fueling creativity is a dangerous and misleading myth. Addiction is a serious disease that can have devastating consequences not only for individuals but also for their loved ones.
It's a reminder that behind that romanticized image, there's a very real and often painful struggle. Okay, let's move on to one last category of conditions that's relevant to our discussion. Neurodevelopmental disorders, specifically autism spectrum disorders, or ASD.
The link between ASD and creativity is a particularly fascinating area of research. Individuals with ASD often face challenges with social communication and exhibit repetitive behaviors. But they can also possess extraordinary abilities in specific areas like music, math, or art.
And this is where the idea of savant syndrome comes into play, right? Those individuals who demonstrate these exceptional skills in specific areas.
Exactly. Savant syndrome is a rare condition in which individuals with developmental disabilities, often including ASD, display remarkable abilities in specific areas that surpass those of neurotypical individuals.
So is the idea that their brains are wired differently, allowing them to process information in unique ways that lead to these incredible abilities?
That's the current thinking. And while savant syndrome is relatively rare, it really highlights the potential for creativity to emerge even in the context of developmental differences.
It truly challenges our assumptions about what creativity is and where it comes from. It's not just about artistic talent or intellectual brilliance. It's about a unique way of perceiving and interacting with the world.
Beautifully said. And it's a compelling argument for celebrating neurodiversity and the value that diverse perspectives bring to the world.
This has been such a fascinating exploration of the complex and nuanced relationship between creativity and mental illness. We've covered so much ground, historical examples, scientific research, personal stories. It's really been a multifaceted picture.
It really has. And I think we've seen that while the simplistic mad genius myth might not hold up under scrutiny, there's a genuine connection between these two aspects of human experience.
We've learned that certain mental health conditions like bipolar disorder and schizotypy can be associated with heightened creativity. But we've also emphasized the importance of managing these conditions effectively so they don't become overwhelming and hinder creative expression. It's about finding that balance.
Absolutely. And we've highlighted the need for personalized treatment approaches that are tailored to the individual's needs and goals, not just their diagnosis.
We also challenged that romanticized notion of substance abuse as a fuel for creativity, emphasizing the damaging effects of addiction and the importance of seeking help if you're struggling.
Right.
We also took a look at the fascinating world of savant syndrome, which demonstrates the incredible creative potential that can exist even in the context of developmental differences.
It's a reminder that there are so many ways to be creative, so many ways to express yourself.
And we've emphasized how important it is to celebrate neurodiversity and the value of diverse perspectives.
This deep dive has been a real journey of discovery. I hope it's made you curious about the complexities of the human mind and the amazing potential of human creativity.
If you're interested in learning more, we've included a list of resources in the show notes. Be sure to check them out.
And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections on this episode. Share your comments below. Let's keep this conversation going.
Okay, now that we've delved into the connection between creativity and specific conditions, I'm curious about how we approach treatment for mental illness in creative individuals. How do we address their needs without potentially stifling their creative spark? That seems like a delicate balance to strike.
It is a delicate balance. And, we've talked about how some creative individuals might actually be hesitant to seek treatment, worried that they'll lose that unique edge that they associate with their mental health challenges.
Right. If they perceive their creativity as being intertwined with their challenges, it makes sense why they might resist treatment. They might fear losing a part of themselves.
Exactly. And then there's the concern that medication, while it might be essential for managing symptoms, could have side effects that dampen their creativity. Some medications can affect cognitive function, emotional range motivation, all of which are crucial for the creative process.
So how do mental health professionals navigate this? It seems like a one-size-fits-all approach wouldn't be very effective.
You're absolutely right. A personalized approach is essential. Open communication between the therapist and the individual is paramount. They need to work together collaboratively to develop a treatment plan that addresses both the mental health challenges and supports the individual's creative goals.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, managing symptoms without inadvertently suppressing the very thing that brings joy and meaning to their life.
Precisely. And, in some cases, medication might be necessary to stabilize mood and improve cognitive function, which in the long run can actually enhance creativity. But it's crucial to carefully monitor the effects of any medication, adjust dosages if needed, or even switch medications if necessary.
So it really requires that flexibility and responsiveness to the individual's unique needs.
Absolutely. And it's also important to consider non-pharmacological approaches, such as therapies that focus on building coping skills, managing stress, improving emotional regulation.
Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, comes to mind. It's about helping people identify and change those negative thought patterns and develop healthier behaviors.
Yeah, CBT can be very effective for conditions like anxiety and depression, which are often present alongside other mental health challenges that may be linked to creativity.
And I also imagine that creative therapies like art therapy, music therapy, or writing therapy could be especially beneficial.
You're right. These therapies provide a safe and expressive outlet for emotions. They can help individuals connect with their creativity as a source of healing and resilience.
It's not about suppressing their creativity, it's about harnessing it, turning it into a force for good.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that recovery is a journey, not a destination. There will be ups and downs. It's crucial for these individuals to have a supportive network, family, friends, mental health professionals, to help them through those challenges.
It sounds like treating mental illness in creative individuals requires a holistic approach.
Yeah.
One that takes into account their unique needs and strengths.
You've summed it up beautifully. It's about recognizing that creativity can be both a vulnerability and a strength. It's about working collaboratively to find a path towards well-being that allows that creativity to flourish.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. We've explored this complex, often paradoxical relationship between creativity and mental illness. We've delved into historical examples, scientific research, personal stories. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And I think we've seen that while the mad genius myth might be an oversimplification, there's a real and fascinating connection between these two parts of the human experience.
We've learned that certain mental health conditions like bipolar disorder and schizotypy can be associated with heightened creativity.
Right.
But we've also emphasized the importance of managing these conditions effectively so they don't become overwhelming and actually hinder creative expression.
Absolutely. And we've highlighted the need for personalized treatment approaches that are tailored to the individual's needs and goals, not just their diagnosis.
And we challenge that romanticized notion of substance abuse as a fuel for creativity, emphasizing the damaging effects of addiction and the importance of seeking help if you're struggling.
Right.
We also explored that fascinating world of savant syndrome, which demonstrates the incredible creative potential that can exist even in the context of developmental differences.
It's a reminder that there are so many ways to be creative, so many ways to express yourself.
And we've emphasized how important it is to celebrate neurodiversity and the value of diverse perspectives.
Well, this deep dive has been a real journey of discovery. I hope it sparked some curiosity for our listeners about the complexities of the human mind and the amazing potential of human creativity.
If you're interested in learning more, we've included a list of resources in the show notes, so be sure to check those out.
And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections on this episode, so share your comments below. Let's keep the conversation going.
Until next time, keep diving deep.